Welcome again to our workshop, Information Literacy Foundational Concepts and Teaching Strategies. I'm very excited to have you all here with me today. My name is Jane Hammonds, and I'm an associate professor. I'm the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian in the University Libraries at Ohio State. And you can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. If you have any questions about the workshop today or any questions in general that I can help you with, please feel free to send me an email. So some of the outcomes of the workshop today, we're going to look big picture at what information literacy is and talk a little bit about how the definition of information literacy has evolved over time, the way that we tend to talk about information literacy and the work that we do in my department with instructors, talk about some strategies and activities for teaching information literacy, and I'm going to share a bunch of resources. We're not going to have time to go in depth of all the resources that I have to share, but you'll all have access to all of the slides afterwards. Put those in the chat one more time. So you can access all of those resources. So if you're here primarily in an instructional role, whether you're an instruction in one of the disciplinary fields or you're a librarian as an instructor, I hope that you'll be thinking about how you can incorporate information literacy concepts into your classes as a teaching role. For those folks that are librarians, you may also be thinking about, work that you do engaging with instructors at your institution. So if you're in a position where you collaborate with instructors, or you can think about giving a workshop or something for instructors, how you might be talking about and communicating about information literacy with the instructors in your area. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about information literacy? We spent a little bit of time thinking about concept, skills, dispositions that are associated with information literacy. First, I wanted to give you all a chance to share your understanding of information literacy. So we have a quick Mentimeter that should allow folks to share how you would define information literacy. Put that in the chat there as well. If you click on the Menti link, that should take you out to that Menti. And by the way, if ever I say anything that it doesn't seem to align with what you all are seeing, please do go ahead and let me know. But hopefully you folks should be able to see and access the Mentimeter. If you don't, someone give me a hands up or just let me know. And share your response there of how you would define information literacy. If you have trouble accessing the Menti for any reason, you can also share in the chat. Yeah, so the link is there in that chat. Oh, got the wrong link. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me try to get that link. Back to the slides. All right. So instead of trying to deal with the Menti, why don't folks go ahead and share the responses in the chat if you're comfortable doing that, because I don't want to take the time. I see a few folks have been able to access it. But please go ahead. If you can't share in the Menti, you can go ahead and share your response in the chat of how you would define information literacy. So there's that QR code if you're able to access it using that. So seeing responses coming in, a lot of folks that are talking about finding and evaluating information. So knowing how to look for information, how to determine if it's valuable, access, evaluating use, critically analyze information. So Peter shared knowledge of the structures and processes of information discovery, retrieval, and evaluation. Ability to find, evaluate, and use information. So I think you can see, you're getting a lot of similarities, which is, of course, totally understandable. But a lot of folks talking about information literacy in terms of being able to locate the information that you need, being able to evaluate that information, that seems to be really key, and then being able to use that information in some way, right? So lots of definitions that are kind of aligning around that theme, which is totally, again, the way that information literacy has often been defined. So we'll go ahead and go back to our slides there. Apologies with the mix up about the Menti. I thought I had checked all of the links beforehand, but of course, always has to be something that goes wrong. So we'll go back to our slideshow here. So hopefully folks are seeing the slides again. Do let me know if you are not. All right. So I wanted to share a couple of definitions of information literacy, and I know the librarians in the group are probably familiar with these definitions. I did want to mention that the definitions I'm going to share are very heavily the North American definitions, so the definitions that have been developed by the ALA and the ACRL, but that there are many other definitions of information literacy out there. Organizations across the world have created their own definitions of information literacy. So these are the ones that we're going to talk about and the ones that we use in our work at Ohio State when we talk about information literacy. But there may be other definitions as well that you find really helpful or relevant, and that's totally fine as well. So this is the very influential definition of information literacy that was shared by the American Library Association in 1989. And information literacy is the ability to recognize when information is needed, to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information. So that very clearly aligns with the definitions of information literacy that a lot of folks were sharing in the Menti or in the chat. So locate, evaluate, and use the information that you need. So this is the definition of information literacy from the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which a lot of folks know came out around 2015. And so this definition talks about information literacy as a set of integrated abilities, including the reflective discovery of information and understanding of how information is produced and valued, and then the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So what do you all see as the key distinctions between these definitions? So if anyone feels comfortable sharing in the chat, what do you see or what do you think of as the key distinctions between these definitions? And I'll show each definition again in just a second. But again, if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat how you see these definitions as being different. So here's the 1989 definition, the ability to locate, evaluate, and use the needed information. And then here is the 2015 definition, so the reflective discovery of information, understanding of how information is produced and valued, creating new information, participating ethically in communities of learning. So what do you see as the key distinctions between this definition? If you're comfortable sharing in the chat, you can go ahead and do so now. So some of the responses coming in. So Julie shared actions versus mindsets. Let's see. Tiffany shared the framework included content creation and ethics. So seeing students as content creators as well, that inclusion of ethics. Evaluation of information is similar. Yeah, I think you're right, Jean. Evaluation is important in both definitions. Lee shared the ACR1 emphasizes the importance of creating new information to engage in information communities, while the first does not mention that. Again, so yeah, this idea of students as the information creators or people as information creators, not just as information consumers. Reflection and engagement. Jody said, I see the first one is about use and the second contributing to it. Seems to take into account the impact of internet and social media. Let's see, Cynthia shared results versus process. Sorry if I'm missing some of them. They're going pretty fast. Let's see. Second is more focused on the critical reflective aspect. Yeah. Theory and ethical creation versus practical application. Yes. Yeah. Great. So yeah, great distinctions that folks are highlighting between these definitions. And I think some of the ones that are really key, the ones that folks have mentioned, the second definition does tend to have more of an emphasis on the creation rather than just the use of information. The one does seem to be a little bit more practically focused. more about the, more about the use and less about the reflection, sort of the understanding of the bigger picture. And, as you're thinking about these two definitions, neither one are right or wrong. And as I mentioned, like there are other definitions of information literacy out there. So it's not necessarily that you have to align yourself with one definition or the other. But one of my goals is to think today about moving us more toward the framework understanding of information literacy that is a more reflective, more participatory, more focused on understanding the big picture of the information environment that we live in. Right. So I talk about information literacy as having three key components: the skills and abilities, the habits or the dispositions, and the conceptual understanding. So, skills like being able to search a database, being able to create a citation, but then also the habits or the dispositions. So, this willingness to seek out relevant and credible information, demonstrating patience and persistence, being willing to ask for help when needed. So some of those habits or those attitudes that really effective researchers or information users tend to display. And then the conceptual understanding. So having this broader understanding of the information environment that we're living in and how information is created and who creates information and why, what are the different purposes, what are the different ways of accessing information, what is the legal and ethical environment in which we live that impacts how we can access information, understanding the various ways that information is shared and used, and thinking about their own role, students' own role as information creators as well as information consumers. So in a lot of work that I do personally, we tend to talk a lot about, when we talk with instructors, talking a lot about more the conceptual understandings and the habits. Not that the skills are not important, but if we limit from my perspective, if we limit our teaching of information literacy to skills, I feel that we are not going to prepare students as well as they need to be, because we know so many of those things are going to change, right? We can teach them how to use a database, but those databases that, it's going to change over time, what that database looks like. After they leave our institutions, they may not have access to a lot of those resources anymore. And so the way that we tend to talk about information literacy in my department in the libraries is we tend to focus more on thinking about the habits and the dispositions and the understandings than just trying to focus on teaching skills. But I recognize that how you go about teaching information literacy is going to depend significantly on your context and your role. But in the big picture, I see information literacy as having these three big components. So some of the key concepts that I really want to talk about, and unfortunately we don't have a ton of time to get into all of the key concepts, but as those folks that are librarians in the group likely know, the Framework for Information Literacy highlights 6 core information literacy concepts. And these concepts represent sort of shared understandings about research or scholarship or about information use that are kind of broadly shared among experienced researchers across disciplines, and that which often influence our expectations for student performance, but that sometimes we don't actually talk about. So they're tacit or unrecognized or unspoken, even though they can really impact how we perceive whether or not students are able to meet our expectations. So to think more about this, I have a quick little scenario here. So imagine a student who writes a paper on treating anxiety in college students and recommends this therapy method called therapist assistant online therapy. Found a great article that said that this method really works really well and was really excited about this, and so wrote about this in her paper. But then she gets a poor grade on her paper because her instructor tells her she didn't use enough additional sources. She focused all of what she was talking about basically on this one article and didn't talk about any other sources. And she doesn't really understand why she's expected to use additional sources because the article that she found seems to answer the question that she has. So thinking about this in the big picture, why do we ask students to use more than one source, right? We see these requirements all the time in assignments that students are given. Sometimes it's specified that they have to use a specific number of sources, but other times it's just, it's the expectation that they are going to use multiple sources. So why do we ask students to use more than one source? Please go ahead and share any thoughts that you have in the chat. Why we ask students to use more than one source. If that student found an answer that worked for her in that one article, why does she need to have other sources? Right. So lots of folks putting in there about different perspectives, right? The importance of having different perspectives. Mary shared each source has some level of bias and only reflects one perspective. Right, to increase perspectives, identify and fill in gaps. Angel shared that one source can be wrong. Multiple sources can validate or disprove the findings, right? Some sources may be incomplete, right? More evidence or perspective. So clear recognition, right, in the comments that there's this need that we have to see different perspectives, right? That one article can be biased, that one article can be just wrong. So we need to see what other people are talking about. We need to see other answers that folks have come up with in the field, right? And so basically, right, we have this understanding, and somebody mentioned this in the chat, of this idea of scholarship as conversation, right? So we know that for whatever topic or question a student is looking at, there's going to be multiple people who have been exploring that question or topic, and they have been publishing research on that question or topic. So each one of those sources represents their voice, right? Their perspective. But we know that the findings and the perspectives can vary significantly. Who did they actually study? How big was their population? What methodology did they use, right? So we know that there are all of these different interpretations and comparisons, and there may be another article out there that she didn't find that recommends a completely different type of therapy, and is just as sure about that as the article that she read, right? So we know that there's this need to find the different perspectives, as someone mentioned, to see, is there any consensus in the field? Are we building toward a consensus where it seems like a lot of folks are agreeing based on the number of studies that are looking at this one type of method that this really works, right? And we know that the perspective can change over time, right? So we have this understanding that anytime we're doing any kind of research, we have to get multiple perspectives and see what's going on in the field, see what scholars are talking about in the field, right? But a student may not have that perspective at all. And so this requirement or this expectation that we have that they use multiple sources may not make a lot of sense, right? Because they had a question, they think that there's a right answer to that question, right? And so they find one article that has the answer to the question, and that's what they need to do, right? What we have this broader perspective of, we know that there's rarely going to be one right answer, right? That there are going to be this range of perspectives, and their job as a student, as a researcher, is to consider all of those different perspectives and analyze them, bring them together to create her own answer. All right, so scholarship as conversation, right? So this is one of those key concepts from the framework for information literacy, this idea that experienced researchers think about research as this ongoing conversation in which new ideas are continually being shared, and this recognition, this understanding that no one source is going to provide the complete perspective, or that there's generally not going to be one clear right answer to a question, a research question that a student might have. Right, so scholarship is conversation, one of the 6 core concepts. So here's another scenario. So this is a scenario: a student named Tucker is giving a presentation in his history class, and he cites this website that's called Ben's Guide. It's a government website that provides information on how the government works that is geared toward children. And so Tucker's told, as he gives his presentation, that this is not an appropriate source to use in college level research, even though the information on there is accurate, right? So again, putting it out to you all, why is it considered to be inappropriate for a college student to use a website such as Ben's Guide, which is aimed at children in a college presentation. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to go ahead and share those in the chat. Oh, it's already 12:24. Time is going so fast already. So intended audience for the info is not contextually appropriate, right? It's not going to go into enough depth. Sources oriented to adults are more nuanced, presents more complex ideas, right? So yeah, so this is a site that just gives very basic level information, right? And so within the particular context that this student is doing the work, it's not going to include enough depth. It's not going to include enough nuance, right? It's just not going to be considered appropriate as a source to cite. Right. So again, right, so we have, as more experienced researchers, we have this shared understanding. We know that information is created for a range of different purposes and different audiences, and not all information is going to consider to have the same level of authority or credibility, right? A source that may be perfectly appropriate to use in everyday life may not be appropriate to use in a college, research paper or presentation, or not appropriate to cite, in our own research. We know, right, as scholars, that when we publish, right, if we stray outside of certain types of sources, that can cause our work to be looked at less positively, right? Because there are clear expectations within the academic context of the types of sources that are appropriate and the types of sources that are not appropriate, right? So we have this understanding of this idea of authority being constructed and contextual, right? So we know that there are many different factors that contribute to making a source authoritative. And we know that different communities may recognize different types of authority. And in this case, the academic community, right, broadly speaking, right, has certain types of sources that it generally considers to be more authoritative than others. And if we cite sources outside of that, it's going to not demonstrate the same level of understanding, as folks said, the same level of nuance or complexity as the types of sources that we tend to cite. So this is the second key concept, right? So this idea that authority is constructed and contextual. Not all sources have the same level of authority. In certain contexts, some kinds of sources are going to be considered more authoritative than others. So those are two of the 6 core concepts in the framework for information literacy. Authority is constructed and contextual, and scholarship is conversation. Very briefly, just to talk about the other ones. So information creation as a process. This talks about the need for there to be an understanding of the processes by which information is created and shared, and an understanding that there are different formats of information. And there's a really complex relationship between the creation process, the format, and authority. So certain formats of sources are going to be considered more authoritative or appropriate in certain contexts because of the creation process that is associated with those sources. So why are peer-reviewed sources generally considered more authoritative? Because we understand the creation process for those sources. We understand the review process for those sources, right? And that has a different level of creation and review than a blog post that someone puts up online. Information has value. So this indicates that, how important it is for our students to understand all of the different ways that information may have value. And the fact that there are all of these legal and ethical guidelines around information creation, access, and use. So our students need to be aware and familiar, not just of, guidelines around plagiarism, but things like intellectual property, copyright, so that they're familiar with all of the forces, basically, that are impacting the way in which information is valued and which type of information may be considered more valuable than others, who has access to information, right? So this also includes a recognition that because information is valuable, because there is often a cost associated with information, not everyone is going to have the same level of access to information. So information creation is process, information as value. And then the final 2 key concepts are research as inquiry, right? So the understanding of research as this collaborative process that is taking place, that is driven by questions that have been unanswered in a particular field or across fields. and that the goal of this research process is to extend the knowledge in the field, but with a recognition that you're rarely going to have the one right answer, right? Instead, the answers are going to continue to lead to new questions. So it's this iterative, ongoing process that scholars or professionals within a field or discipline are working to answer key questions in the field. And then the last key concept, searching as strategic exploration. So being familiar with the capabilities and characteristics and limitations of various search tools, a recognition that a search tool that you can use in one situation may not work in another situation. You may have had situations where, a student will say, well, what database did you use? Well, I use JSTOR. Well, this is a chemistry class. Why would you use JSTOR? That's not really the appropriate database. Well, that's the one that they learned how to use in high school, right? So moving beyond having a very limited set of search tools and search strategies to think about how context impacts the way that you go about searching for information. So those are the 6 key concepts that are highlighted in the framework. Important to mention that the framework was meant to be a living document. It's actually going to be undergoing review. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these are the only key understandings out there. These are the ones that have been highlighted in the framework, but there may be other core sort of conceptual understandings that you think that students need to learn as well to understand research. But for me, the key point is that if we think about these concepts like scholarship as conversation or research as inquiry, that if students don't understand these concepts, it contributes to this expert-novice gap. So some of the things that we ask students to do may not make a lot of sense because they are not approaching this with the same mindset, the same way of thinking that more experienced researchers are, right? So you think about an assignment like an annotated bibliography. In my experience, students often have a lot of trouble with annotated bibliographies, right? Because they will cite each source separately, right, and describe each source separately, but will not put them in conversation with each other, right? Because they don't recognize that as the expectation, right? We think about an annotated bibliography as a way to see what all of these scholars in the field are saying so we can get an idea of what that conversation looks like. Right. But a student may not have that perspective. And so asking them to do an annotated bibliography, they may not really understand the underlying purpose that we have for them. Right? And the challenge is, of course, is that the more experienced you become, the harder it is to see things from the perspective of a novice learner. So things that you just take for granted as a more experienced researcher, as a scholar, as a librarian, right, may not be, familiar to students at all. And we often will sometimes have these moments when we kind of realize, oh, wow, there's a really big gap here in understanding. And I've shared this example before, but I had a student once who turned in their bibliography and the citation list was all last name, comma, first name, title of the journal. The student didn't actually fill that information in. They literally said last name, comma, first name, title of the journal, right? And so there was like this, the student just didn't recognize that we actually expected them to put the actual source that they were using in there, right? And I know that sounds like, oh, how could they not get that? But, I've had other examples, a student giving a call, my instructor says that we have to look for academic sources, but all you have are scholarly sources. Where do I find the academic sources? For the instructor, it's just natural to assume that academic sources and scholarly sources and peer review sources generally mean the same thing. But for a student, that distinction may not be clear. So all of these things contribute to this existing expert-novice gap. And so a lot of the things in the work that we do is thinking about how we can start to narrow this gap. How can we make some of these things that are hidden more clear to students? And so that's really how I conceive of teaching information literacy. That it's not just about teaching students skills that they need, like search skills, but it's about teaching students the ways of thinking and knowing that are shared among experienced researchers, trying to illuminate that hidden curriculum that is creating that bottleneck for students, that thing that they're just not getting, that's not allowing them to progress in their learning. So What are the things that we do and understand as experienced researchers that we may not be telling students, but that still impacts our expectations for how they perform? And what are the ways that we can raise those to the surface and make those clear to students and help them understand what those concepts are? Just wanted to mention really quickly, there's a lot of debate out there about information literacy and its relation to other literacies like digital literacy, media literacy, with some folks arguing that we should move away from the term information literacy and thinking about how these are positioned next to each other. And I don't want to get into the weeds of this debate at all, but I did just want to mention, if information literacy, if media literacy or digital literacy is a term that works better for you in your context, that's totally okay. We do tend to talk about information literacy in the work that we do, but that may not work on every campus or every institution. So thinking about what is going to work best in your context. All right, so I'll pause here to see if there are questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share. Any folks that would like to share how this understanding of information literacy may compare to your previous understanding, if there's any change in that, and how this more conceptual view of information literacy might impact how we go about teaching information literacy. So I'll pause there to see if we have questions, comments that folks would like to share. Yes, Ashley shared, I like the idea of framing it as teaching the skills they're needed as professionals in their field. And that's actually a really great point, Ashley. And that's one of the challenges, of course, is that information literacy doesn't look exactly the same, right? In every discipline or every field, right? And if you're preparing students to go into academic careers, it may be different than if you're preparing students to go into the workplace. And so it's really challenging to think about what one sort of core information literacy curriculum might look like, because information literacy itself is dependent on the context. Let's see, other comments coming in. Teaching faculty about InfoLit helps illuminate for them why students seem to be failing at what they consider basic research and writing skills. Yes, Julie, I completely agree. I actually had an email this morning from a previous colleague who shared an email that comment that she had gotten from an instructor that participated in a workshop that we had given. And the instructor talked about how we had asked her, she's in English, and we had asked her, what are the key journals in chemistry? And she's like, I don't know what the key journals in chemistry are. Why should I know that? And I'm like, well, you shouldn't know that, but think about this perspective from the perspective of a student. When you tell them to use journals in English, how would they know what they are, right? Do you actually tell them which journals that they're supposed to be using? Do you tell them which databases they're supposed to be using? Or is that something that you become so normal for you that you don't recognize that students don't have that same level of knowledge? Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really key, that one of the goals that we have is to help instructors think about what are the things that I may be doing that are contributing to these learning bottlenecks for students. Not that they're trying to do it, but it's just because things become so normal and natural to them that we can help them to see, oh, maybe I actually need to talk about these things with my students. Yeah. Yes, election year definitely as to apply immediate context to the importance of IO. Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. All right, since we're already rapidly running out of time, wonderful, Jody. Yes, that's the hidden curriculum. I think, once you start talking about it and thinking about it, it really does become clear how much knowledge you gain over time and how much of that becomes internalized. And it just kind of influences our expectations without even realizing that it is. So what are some of the key information literacy learning bottlenecks that students might experience? So if you're not familiar with the phrase bottlenecks, Joan Middendorf and David Pays talk about learning bottlenecks as places in a course where students tend to struggle or get stuck. So those kinds of things we see them struggle with year after year, semester after semester. Why can't they get this, right? Why do they continually, use sources that are not appropriate? Why do they continually not cite their sources? Those kinds of things. So there can be a lot of different learning bottlenecks related to information literacy. This is a model of the research process that was developed at Ohio State several years ago before I even got there. But we continue to use it and talk about it as a way of showing the complexity of the research process. And one instructor that we were working with talks about, right, this doesn't even capture the complexity, right? There should be arrows going off, out of the edges and circle back again, right? But one of the things that we use and we talk about this is a way to help instructors see, right? A lot of these parts of the research process are things that they can skip, right? Or that they do without even thinking about. So, think about the key getting started with a research paper. We often talk about, okay, you have to identify your topic, you have to develop a research question. How often as experienced researchers do you tend to develop a completely new research question on a topic that you are unfamiliar with, right? Not really often, right? At least in my experience, right? All of the research that I do is builds on the previous research that I've done. The research questions just kind of come naturally out of the previous research that I've done. And so I don't just sit down and say, okay, I need to think of a completely new research topic and do research in this completely new area. But our students are taking 4 or 5 classes a semester, and they might, be asked to develop a research question in 3 of those classes on topics that they're completely unfamiliar with, right? And so something that's pretty simple to a lot of more experienced researchers can be a real learning bottleneck for students because of how difficult it is to develop a research question without having knowledge of the field, right? So some of the key learning bottlenecks, and these are very big picture, right? So students may just not understand the expectations for research assignments. Students may think research assignments are about compiling and summarizing existing information, which is of course part of the research process, but we often want students to go beyond that, right? We don't want them to just compile and summarize. We want them to bring that information together, to synthesize that information, and then to do something with that, to make an argument, an interpretation, right? Analysis in some way. So it's not just about, I'm going to summarize this source and this source and this source, and then that's it. But we want them to do more than that, and they may not be familiar with that expectation. Again, I already mentioned there's research out there that students tend to use a very limited range of search tools. They may be using search tools that are not appropriate to the context. They may not realize how different, for example, the results can be between one database and then the next. I used to, for example, give students an assignment where I'd have them all in groups type the same search terms into different definitions and tell me how many results that they got. And one group, or different databases, sorry. And one group would say, oh, we got 50 results using those search terms. And the other group would say, oh, we got 10,000 results using those different search terms, right? And that was a way to get them to see that, just because you're using a database does not mean that you're using the database that's going to get you the information that you need, that how important, it is to recognize what databases work in particular disciplines or fields. And the same with journals and, other types of information sources, that there are going to be certain information sources that work better in certain disciplines or fields. Evaluating sources. We already talked about this. It was mentioned in the chat as well, right? This can be a big challenge for students and for very many reasons why. But, thinking about, for example, how difficult it is nowadays to tell what the format of a source is, right? How do you distinguish between a news article and a blog post and a trade article and a scholarly article? They're all found online, right? And a lot of the markers that distinguish different types of sources are no longer exist, right? So, they looked very different in print, but online they can all look the same. And so that is one reason, for example, why students might struggle to evaluate sources, because they just don't see the distinctions between the sources the way that a more experienced researcher might. And then using and citing sources ethically. Obviously, there can be lots of bottlenecks that students have around this. So those are some of the very big picture sort of learning bottlenecks that students might experience. If you have others that you would like to add, feel free to add those in, or if you have any questions. I'm going to spend too much time here since we're already rapidly running out of time. and I want to share some activities and resources. But any questions, comments that folks would like to share? If you do, please go ahead and continue put them in the chat. So teaching strategies and activities. Right. So a big picture strategy that we talk about a lot is this idea of decoding the disciplines. So this is a model that was developed by Joan Middendorf and David Pace. That's a multi-step module that is intended to narrow the gap between expert and novice thinking. So the first part of it is what we've already talked about, defining a bottleneck. So what is the thing where are the students getting stuck, right? And then the next part is for the instructor or the librarian, or whoever's teaching that, to think about what are the mental tasks, what are the things that I do to in this situation, and how can I model those tasks for students, right? So how can I think about, okay, this is how I know how to do this, and I'm going to show my students that this is what they need to do. So it's this process of thinking about what those bottlenecks are, think about the hidden curriculum, the hidden knowledge that may be contributing to that bottleneck, and then showing students, modeling those tasks for students, letting them have practice and feedback, so that they are able to, get that feedback, and you get the feedback as well of what is going wrong with them or what is contributing to this issue that students are experiencing. So we tend to combine decoding the disciplines a lot with when we talk about information literacy in the framework with information literacy for instructors as a model that instructors can use to think about, how can I be more transparent in my expectations with students? How can I narrow the gap? So if you think about all of the steps that may go into this issue that students are experiencing, all of the things that may be contributing to that, and then provide them with more explicit guidance for how to actually do the task that you want them to do. Some of the key questions in thinking about decoding the discipline, right? So how would I do this? So if I want my students to do a literature review, for example, how would I go about doing this? Where would I search for information? How would I find the articles that I need? How would I understand what it means to actually do a literature review? What kinds of expertise or knowledge am I drawing on that students may not have yet? Do they even, for example, have an understanding of literature in the same way that we talk about literature when we think about a literature review, right? So what are the sort of hidden understandings or knowledge practices that I may be drawing on? And then what guidance do I need to provide students to help them overcome that, help them move across that gap to understanding? That strategy is very closely related to the strategy of transparency in learning and teaching. Some folks may be familiar with this model that was developed by Marianne Winklemas and some of her colleagues, that talks about the importance of any time that we give students a research assignment, we have to really carefully clarify three things. We have to tell them the purpose. Why are we asking them to complete this assignment? It may be clear to us, but it may not be clear to them. Especially if you have a scaffolded assignment, students may not see that assignment that you're asking them to complete week 2 is going to have a big impact on that assignment that you're asking them to submit in week 14, right? So why are you asking students to complete this assignment? What are they going to get out of it? How does it connect to other assignments? How does it connect to the course learning goals? Being really clear with students about why we're asking them to do something. The next part of this is the task. So really letting students know what you want them to do, where to go, how they should get started. If there are things that you don't want them to do, or things that you've seen that lead other students astray in the past, you can tell them that, right? So one of the things we might see, the task, instructors might say, well, find 3 scholarly articles using one of the library databases. Well, first of all, are students going to know what you mean by scholarly articles? And then are they going to know which library databases that you want them to use, right? At Ohio State, we have hundreds and hundreds of databases. How are students supposed to know which ones that they are supposed to use unless you tell them? So being very explicit about the tasks that they need to complete. And then telling them how their work will be evaluated. So what are the most important aspects to focus on? One of the things we talk about here a lot of times when you see assignment instructions, One of the first things that you'll see on the assignment instructions are things like this needs to be 10 pages long, it needs to be this font, it needs to be double spaced, that kind of thing. It's not that it's not important to include that information, but if that's the first information that students see, they're going to think that that's really important, right? And so that's what they focus on. They focus on things like, do I have the right number of sources? Is this formatted correctly? Right? Instead of what we actually want them to be focusing on, what we're wanting them to learn from this or get from this, they focus on the things that they can understand. And it's things like page limit, number of sources, those kinds of things. So thinking about where you share that information and how you let students know what is most valuable and what is not. I often use strategies taken from the book Small Teaching by James Lang, if folks are familiar with that one. But one of the things that he talks about is 5 or 10-minute instructional interventions that you can use that can help students to learn the concepts that you're wanting to learn them. So asking opening questions where you're requiring students to retrieve prior knowledge that they have about a topic, or asking students to do something like predicting. So say you're doing a demonstration on how to use a database and you change one of the limiters, asking students to predict how that's going to change the search results. Self-explaining, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but having students explain out loud what they are doing so that you can hear, oh, okay, this may be something that's causing them trouble because what they're saying doesn't align really with what I'm hoping that they're actually would be doing. So those are 3 sort of big picture strategies that we talk about a lot: decoding the disciplines, transparency in learning and teaching, and the small teaching method. So if any of those are helpful to you as you're thinking about either teaching yourself or thinking about working with instructors, the TILT model has become really well known at Ohio State's campus. Not just because of the libraries, other folks give workshops on TILT as well. But we've noticed recently that it's something that's a lot of instructors really latch onto as something that they can do that's really helpful for their students. Some different kinds of teaching activities I want to share. One activity that I want to highlight, one that I think is really helpful, is we have students do an assignment called interpreting a research assignment. So basically what we have students do is review the assignment instructions and like annotate the assignment. So they can do things like ask questions in the assignment, underline terms or phrases that they don't understand, circle the active verbs that tell them what they're supposed to be doing, analyze, interpret, evaluate, those kinds of things, identify the key requirements that they have, right? And so, you can have them do this electronically, have them do this on paper copies, but interpret that assignment and then give and tell you what it is that they think you want them to do, right? So, okay, here's this assignment instruction. Now you tell me what I'm looking for, what I'm expecting you to do. And you can get a lot of really great feedback, because this is where you can really highlight things like, oh, I'm having them to do a literature review, but they're clearly not really understanding what I mean by the term literature. Or I said that they need to use scholarly sources, but they don't know what scholarly sources are exactly. Or the action verbs that we use can be very confusing sometimes for students. What is the difference between interpret, evaluate, analyze, clarifying what we mean by those terms for our students. So interpreting a research assignment, that's a really helpful activity that we found to get feedback from the students about what they think that they're supposed to be doing, and allow the instructor an opportunity to give additional guidance. Some other types of activities that I found really helpful. This is really basic and simple, but I use true-false activities all the time. And I've got some sample ones here that folks can look at, but giving students 5 statements about the project or the activity that you're asking them to do, and say, is this true or not? So evaluating sources, for example. One of the statements could be, a source that is a .org source is always a credible source. And you ask them, is that true or is that false? And then based on their response, you provide clarifying information. Well, a few folks said that generally it's true that .org sources are, But then you could talk about, well, is that really the case? I don't think so, but well, don't really have time to get into that. But giving students statements that allow you to get an idea of where they are, what their prior knowledge is, what their current level of understanding is. And it's very simple, it takes 10 or 15 minutes, but it gives you a lot of great feedback about what they understand or don't understand. So I mentioned before, self-explaining activities can be really helpful. So having students just tell you, talk out loud, talk to another student, what it is that they would do if they had some sort of research task to do. So, oh, I need you to go find a scholarly article. Well, they just would talk through how they would go about finding a scholarly article. In the one class that we teach, we have students do a screencast, and they have to do a screencast of themselves doing a search and narrating their screencast to tell us what steps that they would take to complete the task that they've been given. But this can be really helpful as well for identifying those places where students might be struggling without even realizing it. Various types of defining activities. So giving them key concepts, helping them try to define that concept, and then sharing those understandings, right? And these are things like scholarship is conversation, research is inquiry. Students are not going to get these right away. But starting to talk about what does it mean if we say that scholarship is a conversation? How might that impact what I'm asking you to do here? That could be something that we could talk about. This is also an activity that comes from Small Teaching by James Lang, but he talks about this minute thesis activity. So giving students a concept and giving students related actions or practices and having them connect those two by just writing a sentence. So for example, you could say, okay, information has value. And you could give them a list of terms such as plagiarism, citation, copyright, intellectual property, those kinds of things. And in one sentence, have them explain how they think plagiarism is connected to the concept of information has value. What are the connections that they see? Here's this concept, information has value. Here's plagiarism. What are the connections that you see between these two? So how is the concept related to the practice? Selecting credible sources, lateral reading. So we use a lot of discussion about, going out and evaluating sources by using lateral reading techniques, going out and seeing what other people think, rather than focusing on evaluating the source itself, only that aspect of it. All right, so I have a bunch of resources here. Again, we don't have time to go through all of these resources, but I wanted to share almost all of these resources should be available to everyone. There are a few that are only limited to Ohio State, but in most cases, these should be available to everyone. So resources on teaching, research, and information literacy. For those Ohio State folks, we do have Canvas modules on a lot of these concepts that you can download into your course and use directly into your course. Tons of videos out there on information literacy concepts. We've created online guides on each of the 6 core concepts from the framework. Other, guides that we put together. We have an online textbook. So any of these resources should be available and open to anyone. All right, so we have like 3 minutes left. So upcoming workshops over the next couple of weeks, there's going to be several additional workshops. So hopefully folks are interested in coming to those. But wanted to pause here to open it up to last questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share. So what are the strategies that you use to collaborate with instructors, especially those who have no time for library instruction? So we do a lot of workshops for instructors directly. One of the things that we found helpful recently, so as I mentioned, we have these modules that we've created. And I know that this may not work at every campus or every institution, but we use Canvas as our learning management system. So we've created these pre-made Canvas modules on a bunch of different topics, and instructors are able to request those modules and download those into their courses and then modify those as needed. And we also created an entire, so this page here is basically intended for instructors as here's resources that you can use. So it's videos, activities, readings that they can use to teach information literacy in their classes without having to bring the students in for instruction at all. So that's really one of the strategies that we've taken is we've tried to create as much content as we can that instructors can use and incorporate themselves. Let's see, so additional questions. So the Canvas modules are not in Canvas Commons, but if you have questions about those and you want to see what those look like, if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to either make copies of them or see if we can get you access to those. Wonderful. So if the links are not, the links should be active in the slides. I'll check the slides and make sure the links are working. And if not, I will share all of the slides there. All right. So yeah, so everyone will get a follow-up email that will have links to the slides, the recording from today. I'll again check those links in the slides and make sure everything is working. And make sure that everyone has access to those. So I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes in case folks have any questions they would like to ask off of the recording. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.